The whole situation began about 2 years ago when my wife Leslie and I were going through some rough patches in our marriage. We had been married for 6 years by then, and things had become pretty routine. You know how it is when both of you work full-time and just go through the motions. Leslie worked as a marketing coordinator, and I'm an electrician, so our schedules were quite different, and we didn't spend much time together anyway. I should probably mention that Leslie and I had been trying to have children for about 3 years without any luck. We had done some basic fertility tests, and everything came back normal for both of us. The doctors just told us to keep trying and maybe consider IVF later on. This put a lot of pressure on our relationship because Leslie really wanted to be a mother, and I could see how much it hurt her every month when we faced disappointment again. Around that time, Leslie started going out more after work with her colleagues, which honestly didn't bother me much because she seemed happier and more social. Her company had hired a new guy named Russell, some kind of consultant, and Leslie would sometimes mention him when talking about work. Apparently, he was very successful and had worked for some big companies in California before moving to our city. At first, I didn't think much of it because Leslie had always been friendly with her co-workers. But then Leslie began working late more often and attending these company events that seemed to happen every other week. She'd come home talking about how Russell shared fascinating stories about his travels and business ventures and how he was thinking about starting his own company soon. I started noticing that she was dressing up more for work, like putting extra effort into her appearance. But when I complimented her, she just shrugged it off. The first real warning sign came when Leslie returned from one of these work events, acting really strange and giggly. She kept checking her phone and smiling at it, and when I asked what was so funny, she said it was just some inside joke from work that I wouldn't understand. That rubbed me the wrong way because Leslie had never been secretive about her phone before. We had always been pretty open about that stuff. Over the next few months, Leslie became increasingly distant. She'd come home from work and go straight to her laptop or phone instead of talking to me about our days like we used to. When I tried to plan date nights or suggest doing something together on weekends, she always had an excuse about being tired or having plans with co-workers. The worst part was that our intimate life basically disappeared completely. When I tried to initiate anything, she'd say she was stressed about work or not feeling well. I confronted her a few times, but she insisted I was being paranoid and said she was dealing with a lot of pressure from work and the fertility issues. She'd turn it around on me, saying I wasn't supportive enough, and maybe if I showed more interest in her career and friendships, she wouldn't feel the need to keep everything separate. So I backed off, but I could feel something was seriously wrong. Then about 18 months ago, Leslie came home from work one day looking different, like she was glowing or something. She seemed excited and nervous at the same time and kept fidgeting with her hands. Finally, she sat me down and said she had something important to tell me. My first thought was that maybe she'd gotten a promotion or something because of how she was acting. But instead, she told me she was pregnant. I was shocked because we hadn't been intimate in weeks, but my initial reaction was pure joy since this was what we had been trying for so long. I jumped up to hug her and started talking about how incredible this was and how we needed to call our families and start planning. But Leslie didn't hug me back, and she had this strange expression on her face that I couldn't read. That's when she said, "The baby might not be mine." I just stood there staring at her because I couldn't process what she was saying. She began talking quickly about how she'd made a mistake and had been seeing someone from work, and she was sorry but needed to be honest now that she was pregnant. She said she'd been having an affair with Russell for about 4 months and that they had been careless a few times. I asked if she wanted to work things out and suggested a paternity test to figure out what was really going on, because despite everything that had happened, I still loved her and wanted to try to save our marriage. But then she said something that completely blindsided me. She said she didn't think we needed a paternity test because she had a strong feeling the baby was Russell's. When I asked her what she meant, she said she just had this intuition, like she could sense that the baby belonged to Russell because their connection was much deeper than what she and I had. She said that when they were together, she felt this spiritual and emotional bond she'd never experienced before, and that she just knew in her heart this baby was meant to be his. I told her that was completely insane and that intuition doesn't determine paternity. But she got really defensive and said I wouldn't understand because Russell and I were totally different types of men. She said Russell was more emotionally intelligent and spiritually aware, and that when you have that kind of connection with someone, you just know things on a deeper level. At this point, I was getting angry because she was talking about this other guy like he was some kind of enlightened being, while basically telling me I was too simple to understand their cosmic bond. I told her we were getting a paternity test, whether she liked it or not, because I had a right to know if I was going to be a father. But Leslie refused. She said she didn't want to put the baby through unnecessary stress and that she was confident about who the father was. She said Russell had agreed to step up and take responsibility and that they were planning to be together as a family. She said she hoped we could divorce amicably and that maybe someday I'd understand that this was all meant to happen this way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife of 6 years was sitting there telling me she was leaving me for another man, that she was pregnant with his baby, and that she was basing it all on some kind of mystical feeling she had. When I pointed out she could be wrong, and that I might actually be the father, she just shook her head and said her intuition was never wrong about important things. That's how my marriage ended. Leslie moved out the following week to live with Russell, who apparently had a really nice apartment. She filed for divorce immediately and refused to discuss anything about paternity testing. Her lawyer sent me papers saying she was waiving any claim to child support from me, which I guess was supposed to prove how confident she was that the baby wasn't mine. The divorce went through pretty quickly, since we didn't have kids together, and could split our assets without too much drama. Leslie kept posting on social media about how happy she was and how excited she was to start this new chapter of her life. She'd post pictures of her growing belly with captions about trusting the universe and following your heart, that kind of stuff. Russell seemed to be playing along with the whole thing, from what I could see on social media. He was treating Leslie like a queen, taking her on weekend trips to fancy restaurants, buying her expensive maternity clothes. Leslie would post about how grateful she was to have found someone who truly understood her and supported her dreams. Tried to move on with my life. I focused on work and started dating again after a few months. It was hard because I kept wondering about the baby and whether it might actually be mine. But Leslie had made her choice, and I had to respect that, even though I thought she was being completely irrational about the whole paternity thing. The baby was born about 7 months ago, a little girl they named Luna. Leslie posted all the typical new mum pictures and seemed genuinely happy. Russell was in all the photos, acting like the proud dad, and they looked like the perfect little family. I'll admit, it was hard to see because part of me still wondered what if. But I tried not to dwell on it. Leslie said that even though she'd convinced herself Russell was the father, a part of her was secretly relieved when his DNA test came back negative because it meant there was still a chance Luna could be mine and we could potentially work things out. She said she'd been disappointed when David turned out to be the real father. Not because David wasn't a good guy, but because it meant she'd lost any connection to me permanently. She said she'd realized I'd been the best partner she'd ever had, and that leaving me was the biggest mistake of her life. I could see where this was going and cut her off before she could keep talking. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that it didn't change anything between us. She'd made her choices based on what she wanted at the time, and now she had to live with the consequences. Leslie said she understood but wanted me to know that if I ever decided to be part of Luna's life as a friend or uncle figure, she'd welcome that. She said Luna was a great kid who could benefit from having positive male role models, and that David was supportive of Luna having other caring adults in her life. Honestly, this felt like another manipulation. Leslie was presenting it as being generous and thinking about Luna's best interests, but really, she was trying to create a way for us to stay connected. If I started spending time with Luna as an uncle, it would be natural for Leslie and me to end up talking regularly and potentially developing feelings again. I told Leslie I wasn't interested in that kind of arrangement because it would be confusing for everyone involved, especially Luna. If Luna needed positive male role models, she had David as her father, and could naturally develop relationships with other family members and friends. Leslie looked disappointed, but said she understood. She thanked me for letting her apologize and said she hoped someday I could forgive her for all the pain she'd caused. Then she left without any drama or begging, which was honestly a relief after all her previous emotional manipulation. But a few days later, I got a text from David asking if we could talk. He said Leslie had told him about our conversation and that he had concerns about the situation, ones he wanted to discuss with me. When I called David back, he said he was worried Leslie still wasn't being completely honest about her motivations and feelings. He said she had been pushing for a more romantic relationship with him, and when he made it clear he wasn't interested, she started talking about how she wished things had worked out differently with me. David said he was concerned Leslie was using Luna as a way to try to reconnect with me, and he didn't want his daughter caught in the middle of adult drama. He said he'd been very clear with Leslie that Luna's relationship with him was separate from any feelings Leslie might have about other men, and he didn't want me to feel pressured to get involved just because Leslie was suggesting it. Appreciated David looking out for both Luna and me and assured him I had no intention of getting drawn back into Leslie's orbit. I said I thought it was best if Leslie, Luna and I all stayed in our separate lanes going forward. David agreed and said he was glad we were on the same page. He said Leslie was a good mom to Luna, but seemed to have trouble accepting that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, and he was trying to help her focus on moving forward instead of looking backward, because after that the calls and visits stopped. I figured Leslie had finally gotten the message and was dealing with her problems on her own. I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved back in with her parents temporarily and was looking for a job, so it seemed like she was at least trying to get her life together. But then about 2 months ago, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a man's voice asked if I was Leslie's ex-husband. I said yes, and asked who was calling. He said his name was David, and he was calling about the paternity situation with Luna. My first thought was maybe Leslie had finally gotten a paternity test, and this was someone from the testing company or a lawyer. But then David said he was calling because he recently found out he might be Luna's father. I was completely confused because Leslie had sworn she'd only been with Russell and me during the time Luna would have been conceived. David explained he'd been casually seeing Leslie for a few weeks around that same period, and that she'd told him she was separated from her husband and figuring out her next steps. Apparently, Leslie had met David on some dating app, and they'd hooked up a few times, but then she suddenly stopped responding to his messages. He said he assumed she'd gotten back together with her husband, or found someone else, so he moved on, and hadn't thought about her again until recently. But then a friend showed him some of Leslie's social media posts about Luna. When he saw the baby's birth date, he realized the timing lined up with when they had been seeing each other. He said Luna had some distinctive features that reminded him of his own baby pictures, so he began wondering if there was a chance he could be the father. David said he tried to contact Leslie directly, but she wasn't responding to his messages, and he got my number from someone who knew about our situation. He wanted to know if I could help him get in touch with Leslie about getting a paternity test because he was a responsible guy. And if Luna was his daughter, he wanted to step up and do the right thing. This meant Leslie had been lying to me about only being with Russell and me. She'd been seeing at least 3 different men during that time, maybe more, and she'd been playing all of us. The whole story about her deep spiritual connection with Russell and her intuition about him being the father was complete nonsense. I gave David Leslie's current phone number and told him he could try to contact her directly, but warned that she'd been avoiding taking responsibility for this whole mess from the start. I cautioned him that she'd probably try to convince him a paternity test wasn't necessary and that he should just trust her feelings about the situation. David seemed like a decent guy and said he appreciated the heads up. He said he had a good job and his own place, and if Luna was his daughter, he wanted to provide for her properly instead of letting her grow up in an unstable situation. A few days later, Leslie called me absolutely furious. She said I had no right to give out her contact information to some random man, and that I was trying to sabotage her life because I was bitter. She said David was harassing her and demanding a paternity test, and that she didn't even remember at him that clearly because it had only been a casual thing. I told her that was exactly the problem. She'd been casual with multiple men during the same period, and then made life-changing decisions based on her intuition about which one was the father. Now there was a third possibility, and she was still trying to avoid getting actual facts. Leslie said she'd looked David up on social media, and he seemed like a nice enough guy, but she didn't want to complicate things more by adding another potential father to the mix. She said she was already overwhelmed trying to figure out how to co-parent with either Russell or me, and involving David would only make things more confusing. But I pointed out that she wasn't co-parenting with Russell because he'd kicked her out, and she wasn't co-parenting with me because she'd refused to get a paternity test to find out if Luna was mine. She was just drifting around, avoiding responsibility while others tried to do the right thing. That conversation ended with Leslie hanging up on me, but apparently she did eventually agree to meet with David. From what I heard later, David convinced her that getting a paternity test was the fair thing to do for everyone involved, including Luna, who deserved to know who her real father was. So they got the test done, and guess what? David was Luna's biological father. Leslie called me after she got the results, and she sounded completely defeated. She said she couldn't believe her intuition had been so wrong about everything, and that she'd destroyed her marriage and put Luna through all this instability for nothing. I told her her intuition hadn't been wrong. She'd just been lying to herself because she wanted to believe what was most convenient at the time. When she wanted to justify leaving me for Russell, she convinced herself their spiritual connection meant he was the father. When Russell kicked her out and she wanted me to take her back, she tried to convince herself that maybe the universe wanted us to be together after all. But the whole time, she'd known there were other possibilities she was ignoring because they didn't fit the story she wanted to tell herself. David stepped up like he promised and took financial responsibility for Luna. He got his own paternity test to make it official and started paying Leslie child support and taking Luna for visits. From what I can see on social media, he seems like a good dad, and Luna looks happy and healthy. Leslie moved into her own apartment with David's help and got a part-time job so she could care for Luna while still earning some income. She stopped trying to contact me, which was a relief because I was tired of being dragged into her drama. Well, I was wrong about being done with this. Last month, Leslie showed up at my house again, but this time it was different from her previous visits. She looked put together and calm, not desperate and crying like before. She said she'd been in therapy and had some things she wanted to say to me, asking if I'd be willing to give her 10 minutes to talk. Against my better judgment, I let her in. Leslie sat down and said she'd been working with a therapist to understand why she'd made such poor decisions during our marriage and the whole affair situation. She said her therapist helped her recognize she'd been struggling with deep insecurities about not being able to get pregnant, and that she'd been seeking validation and excitement outside our marriage instead of dealing with those feelings directly. She admitted she'd been selfish and justified her behavior by convincing herself our marriage was already over. Leslie also acknowledged that refusing to get a paternity test had been completely irrational and unfair to everyone involved. She said she'd been so caught up in the fantasy of her relationship with Russell that she'd ignored obvious red flags and made decisions based on wishful thinking instead of reality. I'll admit this was more self-awareness than Leslie had ever shown before, and it was nice to hear her take real responsibility for her actions instead of blaming circumstances or other people. But I also knew Leslie was smart and manipulative, so I was waiting to see what she actually wanted from me. She said she wasn't trying to get back together or asking me to help raise Luna because she understood I'd moved on and that she'd burned those bridges with her behavior. But she wanted to make amends for the pain she'd caused me and hoped we could eventually have some kind of civil relationship since we'd been such a big part of each other's lives. That seemed reasonable enough, and I appreciated that she wasn't asking for anything concrete. I told her I was glad she was getting help and taking responsibility, and hoped she could build a good life for herself and Luna going forward. But then Leslie said there was one more thing she needed to tell me, and this is where things got weird again. She said during her therapy sessions she'd been exploring her feelings about the whole paternity situation and realized part of her had hoped Luna would turn out to be my daughter after all. Then about 3 months ago, I got a phone call from Leslie. She was crying hysterically. At first, I could barely understand what she was saying because she was sobbing so hard. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she told me that Russell had gotten a paternity test done without telling her. Apparently, Russell had started doubting whether he was really the father, especially since the baby didn't look much like him. Leslie said he'd taken some of the baby's hair while she was sleeping one day and sent it off to one of those DNA testing companies along with his own sample. When the results came back, they showed that Russell was definitely not the father. Leslie said Russell confronted her about it and demanded to know who else she'd been sleeping with. She insisted to David that she had only been involved with him and me during that period, so the baby had to be mine after all. But then Russell said if that was true, she needed to contact me and get a paternity test to prove it, because he wasn't going to raise another man's child. Here's the crazy part. Leslie still refused to reach out to me about getting a paternity test. She said her intuition was telling her something wasn't right, and maybe the test Russell had was wrong. She said she still felt like Luna was meant to be Russell's daughter, and that if they just waited and trusted the universe, everything would work out. Russell apparently didn't appreciate this response. He told Leslie she had 1 week to figure out who the real father was and get proof, or he was done with both of them. Leslie spent that week trying to convince him the test was wrong and that they should just ignore it and continue being a family. But Russell wasn't having it. So, he kicked them out. Leslie called me that day crying, asking if she could come over to talk. I told her no because I wasn't going to get dragged back into her drama, especially when she'd refused to give me any information about whether I might be the father when it actually mattered. She begged me to let her explain the situation, but I said she'd had plenty of chances to be honest with me, and chose to trust her intuition instead. Over the next few weeks, Leslie kept calling and texting, asking for help. She said she was staying with a friend, but couldn't afford her own place without Russell's financial support. She said she was overwhelmed trying to take care of Luna by herself and just needed someone to help her figure things out. I ignored most of her messages because I figured this was the consequence of her choices. She'd been so confident that Russell was the father and that their spiritual connection meant more than actual facts. So now, she could deal with reality on her own. Then she started showing up at my house. The first time she came over, she looked terrible. She was carrying Luna and had this huge diaper bag, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She said she just needed to talk and explain everything, that she realized she'd made mistakes, but we could work through them together. I told her, through the door there was nothing to work through because she made her choice 18 months ago when she decided her intuition was more reliable than a paternity test. She started crying, saying she'd been confused and scared, and that Russell had pressured her to choose between him and me, but I wasn't buying it. Nobody pressured her to refuse the paternity test. That was her decision, based on her mystical feelings about who the father was. I told her she needed to leave and figure out her own problems. She kept coming back though, sometimes with Luna, sometimes alone. She'd sit on my porch and call my phone, begging me to open the door and talk. She said she was desperate and didn't know where else to turn, and that even if Luna wasn't my biological daughter, we'd been trying for a baby so long that maybe this was the universe's way of giving us a family. That really pissed me off because suddenly she wanted to talk about the universe's plan when it was convenient for her. When she thought Russell was the father, the universe had brought them together and their connection was deep and spiritual. But now that he'd abandoned them, suddenly the universe wanted her to come back to me with another man's baby. I told her to stop coming to my house or I'd call the police for harassment. She said she understood I was angry, but that Luna was an innocent baby who needed stability, and couldn't I at least consider helping for the baby's sake, even if I didn't want to help her? The thing is, I did feel bad for the baby, because none of this was Luna's fault. But I wasn't going to reward Leslie's terrible decisions by swooping in to rescue her when her plan fell apart. She had been so sure about everything when she left me for Russell, so confident that her intuition was guiding her right. Now she had to live with the consequences. After I threatened to call the police, Leslie stopped coming to my house for a few weeks. But then she started calling me, from different numbers when I blocked her usual one. She'd leave voicemails apologizing, saying she realized she'd been wrong about everything. She said she'd been doing some soul searching and realized that her feelings for Russell had clouded her judgment and that she should have handled the entire situation differently. In one of her voicemails, she admitted she'd been scared to get a paternity test because deep down, she worried the baby might actually be mine, and that would have shattered her fantasy about running off with Russell to live a perfect life. She said she convinced herself her intuition was real because it was easier than facing the possibility she was making a huge mistake. But even with that admission, she still hadn't actually gotten a paternity test to find out whose baby Luna really was. When I called her back to ask about that, she said she was afraid to know the truth. What if Luna wasn't mine either? Then she'd be completely alone with no one to help her. I told her that was exactly why she should have gotten the test in the first place instead of making decisions based on feelings. But she said she couldn't afford the test right now and hoped we could just try to work things out without needing to know for sure. That's when I realized Leslie hadn't learned anything from this whole experience. She was still avoiding responsibility and wanted others to make decisions based on incomplete information. She wanted me to potentially raise another man's child without even knowing if it was mine, just because her other plan hadn't worked out. Update 1. After my original post, Leslie kept harassing me for another month, calling from different numbers and even having her sister contact me to try to convince me to help her out. Her sister called and said Leslie was really struggling financially and emotionally, and that Luna was such a sweet baby who deserved a stable father figure in her life. She said I should consider that maybe this was all happening for a reason, and that I could still have the family I'd always wanted. Even if the circumstances weren't ideal, I told her sister the same thing I'd been telling Leslie, that I wasn't going to make any decisions about helping raise a child without knowing if it was actually mine. If Leslie wanted my help, she needed to get a paternity test first, and if Luna turned out to be my daughter, then we could figure out how to co-parent responsibly. But Leslie's sister said Leslie was afraid the test would come back negative, and she'd lose any chance of reconciling with me. She said Leslie realized I was the stable, reliable partner she should have chosen all along and hoped we could rebuild our relationship based on trust instead of requiring scientific proof. Almost laughed because it was the same delusional thinking that had gotten Leslie into this mess in the first place. She'd trusted her intuition over facts when it came to Russell being the father, and now she wanted me to trust her feelings over facts about getting back together. She hadn't learned anything. So I told her sister I was done discussing it, and that Leslie needed to stop using other people to try to manipulate me into helping her. I said if Leslie wanted to have an adult conversation about getting a paternity test and figuring out the real situation, she could call me herself. But I wasn't going to keep playing these games that seemed to work for a while.